who should win Paulo Costa versus Israel Adesanya? Now, listen to my words. Who should win? So let's take some things for granted. Let's take some liberties here, but based on history, I believe that we would be right. This is going to be a stand-up fight. Adesanya not only doesn't want to go to the ground, he does not possess the skill to get the fight to the ground. Like if he turns to plan B and the fisticuffs isn't going well, he just doesn't possess that skill. Positions out of body locks, inside, outside trips, hip tosses, the double leg takedown. He just doesn't have that skill. Okay. Look at Paulo Costa. Paulo Costa, I don't know that is a black belt in jiu-jitsu, but I know he's also not a purple belt, so that would put him around brown, unless he has got his black belt. But make sure you don't lose the fact that that's what you do once you get to the ground. I'm talking about getting the fight off the feet into the ground. So if we can all concede that this is going to be a stand-up fight, at least if we're turning to history, we turn to history, then unanimously we have to agree that this is going to be a stand-up battle. So when it comes back to who should win, because you don't have guys with equal skills. These are vastly different. If kickboxing had a belt system, which it doesn't, if kickboxing did, Adesanya would be a black belt and Paulo Costa would be further down the list. I understand those things. You understand the intangible known as power, as brute force. You want to know who'd have a black belt in boxing, by example? Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Leonard, Floyd Mayweather. You want to know who won it? George Foreman, Tyson Fury, Iron Mike Tyson. They used other things to get to their effectiveness. They used brute force. They used power. They used pressure. They walked you down and they attacked two parts of your body. If you were great at head movement, no problem. They'll hit you in the body. The body doesn't move. Once you start to kill the body and the hands start coming down to start to protect your kidney and your liver and your abdomen, boom, that's when they come upstairs. Boom, that's when they slip one up the middle. So I'm only suggesting for you what really does matter. Who's better or who's more effective? Because that's what you're faced with right now. Let me take you back to the K1. And K1, most of you will not know about. For reasons that are hard for me to explain, K1 just never caught on, particularly here in North America. We have Bellator doing some kickboxing. We had Pride, Glory, which once even had a television deal with ESPN, but K1 was different. But K1, where it was contested, we used to sell out. They'd have 50,000 people there. They had 61,000 in their all-time record live and in attendance, but there was a part of the world that appreciated it. And I want you to understand that because K1 was a very big deal. If you could go in and win the K1, you have established yourself for sure, accepted by the community as the greatest kickboxer in the world. Well, there was a guy who went over and did K1. The guy didn't know the difference between a wrist lock and a wristwatch. The guy won K1 3 times. The guy's name is Bob Sapp. But Bob Sapp had something different. And that was he had 410 pounds of twisted steel. There wasn't a bit of fat on the bone, and he could just walk guys down. And when guys would hit him and chop at him, he'd push through it. Eventually, he'd find them with some wild and sloppy first-day style punches. None of this is to insult Bob Sapp, by the way, but this happened. He went in there against Ernesto Hoost, who is as scary and intimidating of a kickboxer as God has ever made. He ran right through him. Bob Sapp ran right through him. And everybody else, 3 guys in a night, 3 different nights, 3 championships. Nobody is going to look to Bob Sapp and go, I want those skills. They are going to look to Bob Sapp and say, I want that effectiveness. I want that record. I want those championships. But it's a very different fight, and you have to incorporate this. Because while Paulo Costa is going to have a meaningful size advantage, he will be no less than 200 pounds when he steps in the ring. Israel Adesanya will have breakfast on his way to the scale and still make the agreed upon weight class of 185 pounds. Relevance being, He's not going to have to rehydrate. He doesn't have an ability to rehydrate. He's hydrated as it is. He just weighs 185 pounds. 184, takes a week off on vacation. Maybe he sees 188. In training camp, he's never above 185. So now you are talking about size. Is it the level of size of a 410-pound all-muscle Bob Sapp versus a 245-pound all-muscle Ernesto Hoost? No, it's not. But we still have to apply these principles because you're talking about a stand-up fight. Adesanya moves as well as anybody I can think of. But I'll tell you another guy who moves that same way, and it's a common opponent between the two, and that is Uriah Hall. Uriah Hall is very hard to touch. If you took a before and an after picture of Uriah Hall, you wouldn't know which one was before the fight and which one was after the fight. He doesn't swell up. He doesn't get caught. His lip doesn't get bled. He moves too well. He'll move left. He'll move right. He'll duck. He can do what's called the pull, where he pulls back and kicks miss him. He can just move really well. The other side of the coin, Uriah Hall is a human being, which means his body doesn't move. You fake something towards the head, you come downstairs, and that's one thing that Paulo Costa was able to do to Uriah. He was able to back Uriah Hall up, cut him off, put him into the fence, and start to go to work on that body. I bring that to you as an example because it is going to be your first impression. I'm just challenging you to tell you it's a very lazy interpretation of the fact that Paulo Costa can get is not going to be able to get to Adesanya because Adesanya can get out of the way. Now, Adesanya is going to touch him a lot. Adesanya is going to touch him in the legs in the way he's never been touched. He's going to kick him in the body, and that's going to hurt really bad. He's going to kick him in the head. Adesanya is going to have no problem finding that target. But George Foreman, who is very classic for saying, I will take 3 punches. I will eat all 3 of them if that's what it means for me to get close to land 1 on you. Mike Tyson had a very similar style. You know, Mike moved a lot. He was a little bit harder to hit, but he would get hit to get inside, boom, to deliver that one to the body, boom, to come upstairs, to boom, finish off with the hook. It's one of those matches where the intangibles. I belonged to a gym. It was my first other gym, and it was called Performance Quest. Now, Performance Quest was owned by Randy Couture, who was the reigning UFC champion, and his partner, Dan Henderson, who was the reigning Pride champion. We didn't have belts. We didn't do belts. We did martial arts. We did traditional martial arts. We had kid classes, the whole bit, but we didn't do belts. The reason we did not do belts, and the reason the gym was named Performance Quest, the ideology behind it and the psychology behind it was the only thing we're after is the performance. We don't care how good your technique is or how pretty you look doing it or how many different sequences and setups that you have. The only thing that we have ever cared about in our history of life of competition, largely it started with wrestling, what also doesn't have a belt system. The only thing we care about is the performance. Can you go out there and perform? Can you deal with the pressures? Can you deal with the lights and the people watching? Can you understand the 10-9 must system or the scoring system of whatever the authoritative body that sets up said competition? So that is where the term Performance Quest came from. Now that evolved and adapted, and eventually we became Team Quest. Take from that story what you will. But I would trust that you would agree that while Randy Couture was the sitting heavyweight champion of the world, he had a grand total of no belts. He couldn't have a belt because he never even owned a gi. Dan Henderson, who was the sitting and reigning Pride champion at the time that they came up with this ideology, philosophy, and ultimately the name of Performance Quest, had no belt. He would have nothing to put a belt on because he had no gi. Now, I kind of like it the other way. I kind of like to acknowledge and to award somebody and bring them in front of the group and put a belt around their waist. So no message here is a belt versus no belt. But if you were to take that ideology and you were to extend it to Bob Sapp was not a black belt, but he had 3 great big trophies over 6 feet tall that he held in his hand as they put a $50,000 check in his hand and confetti fell all over the place to say he can deal with anybody else because he's going to use brute force. It's a very interesting matchup. How many classic matchups do we see and we look forward to them? Khabib versus Conor would have been a classic match. Biggest pay-per-view of all time for MMA, estimates of 2.4 million. To put that in perspective, the next closest would be UFC 100, which did just north of 1.7 million. And to put anything close to that, you're going to have to chop the number in half, but it was a classic style. Now they had the grudge and they had the feud and they had the Russia and they had the Ireland. I get all of those things. I'm talking purely stylistically. It was a classic battle of grappler versus striker. This is also a classic battle, except it's striker versus striker. It's technician versus brawler. Totally different. And very interesting when you take into consideration Paulo Costa's ability to corner an opponent and then begin to work the body.